Good afternoon, everyone. How is it going? Wake up! I know you had a good meditative session, but please come back to reality, the chaos. Well, when there is chaos, there is more than anything you need is listening. And this session is all about how leaders can listen better. And we will talk about listening as leadership, using sound, culture, and collective care for our shared planet. Dialogue begins even before we speak. It begins with listening to each other's culture, to the world around us. And in an era when environmental urgency and cultural disconnection is there, the most powerful form of leadership is not speaking, but maybe it begins with just listening. And that's why we have some extraordinary leaders in the field of culture, art, creativity, and preservation to talk about how can we be better leaders by just listening. It's my esteemed honor to introduce one of the most amazing people I know, Amber Mundinger from L-Acoustics, and an extraordinary leader who everybody knows, KATJA IVERSEN from the Museum of United Nations, the UN Live, and CATHY RUNCIMAN from EarthPercent. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
And listening needs a lot of intention and attention, so please pay attention. So now we start with all the speakers. Dialogue starts with listening. Why you think listening is one of the most important leadership skills for today?
I'll jump in, I guess. I mean, I think we're in a culture of limited attention span, as we all know. And I think sound has a way of uniting us, and listening in particular, as sound and silence, I guess I should say, have a way of uniting us. And so it's important for us to listen meaningfully to those around us, and not just to each other, but to interspecies, to nature. Because I think we can learn a lot from both what we're hearing and what we're not hearing, and the lack of things, and how, we really need to have empathy and kindness for each other. So I think listening really can kind of help with that as a leader.
If I may, in a world right now where things are moving so fast, where it's only the 20th of January. Imagine what's happened this year. Things move so fast. So leaders need to be curious. They need to be capable of moving agilely, and they need to be able to listen. They need to be able to listen both to the people that surround them, real listen, not just fake listen. We have a lot of that. They need to be able to listen to trends, what's happening. They also need to be able to listen to nature and get the groundedness, the frequency. Because real good leaders today, they need just to be able to both move fast, think fast, but be grounded. And sound can help with that. And coming from UN Live, the Museum for the United Nations, where we work with culture, music, film, gaming, sports, we see how listening, both to the people who are not normally listened to, but also to music, just can kind of be transformative. And it's not just leaders who need that, it's all of us who needs that.
Beautiful. Bial.
I agree with the comments about speed, how listening slows us down. That's a very important fact. I want to call in the work of an amazing composer, musician, Pauline Oliveros, and her work on deep listening, which, if you don't know it, there's deep listening and quantum listening. It's really interesting stuff. But what she talks about is how when we really listen, we actually enliven and change the environment. It's not a passive process. Hearing is the more passive thing, but listening is a much more active process. And the more deeply we listen, and we've touched here on these ideas of what it means to listen to people. I think we will talk even more about what it means to listen to nature, and then also what it means to listen to music, because music actually impacts directly the areas of our brain that are moved to connection and to empathy. So that really, really matters. Like, the importance of music in people's life, I think, cannot be overstated. It's absolutely fundamental. But I agree with this. The really key point to me, I think, is not just how we listen, but exactly this point on who we listen to. And I think, you know, there's a bit of a leadership crisis in the world. I think people, individuals, are really starting to think about what it means to rebuild power in their own spaces and communities because of what they see as actually certain failures of leadership. And therefore, that thinking about what it means to listen and who you listen to. And I was trying to think of some examples, and I'm going to say something that, you know, regardless of what people's individual politics are, I think this is a useful example. Like, one of, to me, the best examples of what can happen if people listen deeply is Zohran Mamdani's campaign, right, in New York City for the mayor of New York. Now, whatever your view on the politics of that is, what happened there was somebody who simply ran a campaign that said, I'm going to listen to the concerns of ordinary people. That's something that can be easily co-opted by populists who will pretend to listen. But there is really a thing here that's showing a need that people have to say, who's listening to me? Where am I getting an opportunity to be heard? And where are the gaps, where are the vacuums that I think have been created literally by not paying attention to sound, to listening?
Well, that's a good segue to the next session, like sound. You know, you gave a great example. Maybe I can move on to KATJA to understand, how do you use sound to make change in a world that is so fragmented and disrupted with so much noise?
So if I may, I want to give two examples, but just want to say at UN Live, we work with popular culture to move the many people, to engage the many people and move the many people in a more sustainable direction, whether it's in relation to people or planet, inequality, education, gender equality, nature, biodiversity, planetary health, climate. We're not afraid of using these words. I can see it's not everywhere in Davos we're using these words anymore. But working with popular culture, music, film, gaming, sports, that's kind of what we do, because we know that we need the many people to move, because what's happened right now is that people have been pegged against each other. And the one who can peg people against each other will rule. We need a lot more global collaboration, not less. We need a lot more feeling of belonging, global belonging, and we need a lot more empathy. And the empathy just goes in between each other as people, but it also goes between humanity and nature. So just the example, and I know you'll elaborate more on it, we have, together with fabulous partners, developed kind of an initiative that's called Sounds Right, where nature has become the artist she truly is, also legally. So she owns her own sounds for the first time ever, which means that if you listen to nature on the big streaming platforms, you're already doing good, because royalties go back to nature. But leave that. But you know, just in a very short while, 30 million people in 185 countries have been engaged. And that's the power of popular culture. If you go where people are on the platforms they already use, and you listen, you can create unimaginable initiatives that can really move the world. And we need that now.
Thank you. As we move to more conversations around building connection, empathy, for you, Amber, how can we use technology to build more empathy in this world, in connection and change?
Sure. I mean, I think Sounds Right is kind of the perfect example. If you take a track, you know, that an artist has created, and they've included nature as an artist, and say you spatialize that track, you're able to hear every nuance of the instrumentation of that particular artist, the instruments they were using, but also the natural aspect of what they've put in there from nature. So if you say, like, parrots and the rainforest, for example. You're going to hear all of those textures that can envelope and surround you. And I think, that creates something more meaningful for people to experience. It becomes more personal. They become curious. They want to listen more. And I think what Kathy said in terms of music and the importance of music in general cannot be overstated these days. It's the one thing that unifies us all. So the more we can, use technology as a catalyst for that and, partnering on things like Sounds Right, I think it's a great education tool that goes back to conservation and change.
Thank you. Maybe, Kathy, I will just ask you a question. EarthPercent is built on the idea that artists can drive real change. Can you give us some example on the work that you do? How does it work?
Yeah, I think, it's been touched on in lots of places. So there's a crisis of trust. And actually people have one of the most precious and still very trusted relationships that exist is between audiences and artists that they love. And so music fans, in fact, the music fan is that's a deep, committed relationship to the musicians that they love. And we are really underusing that at the moment. I think artists have become very aware in the last year or two the responsibility of having a platform and having a voice. And they're really thinking about what to do with that and how to use it. What we like to do is say, why not let artists do the thing that they really do, which is make art, right? So allow musicians to make music, but if we do the right thing, I think of it as like hacking the structures of music a little bit to make the fact that an artist doing what they do, making beautiful music, a music lover doing something, which is listening to a track from an artist they love, that those two together in that perfect and trusted relationship can actually, first of all, we're generating entirely new funding for Indigenous and community-led conservation around the world. It's a completely new funding stream. It's long-term. But also it unlocks the story that artists want to tell. I think we ask a lot of artists, we're asking them to be advocates and activists on everything. But actually, if you allow them to use their art, then there's no distinction between your activism and your artistry. It's the same thing. And the beautiful thing about nature, allowing people to work with the sounds of nature, first of all, there's real universality, right? We have a very universal reaction to rain sounds, to the sounds of an ocean wave, to birdsong. Birdsong is wired into us neurologically, right? If you hear a really full chorus, that means you're safe. Your brain actually knows that you're safe. So these things are incredibly important. And what we found with artists is if you say, tell a story about nature, if you say to an artist, tell a story about climate, they look at you with a panicky face. They're like, wait, what? And also, am I going to get in trouble? And is everyone going to hate me? And they're going to say, God, just shut. If you say, let's talk about nature, everybody in the world has a nature story. Everybody in this room has a place they love. Everybody, if I said to you, which is the ecosystem that you love? Are you a mountains person? Is this your place? Do you like forests? Are you oceans or beaches? Do you want to be in a desert? Everybody has an ecosystem they love. Everyone has a species they love. We've had artists say, when we've said, what story do you want to tell? Beautiful young female artist, Rosa Walton, she was like, wait, my dad is a moth expert. I want to make a piece of music. Can you get me some recordings of moths? I'm like, what do they even sound like? They squeak, by the way. They make this wild squeaking sound.
That's amazing.
We've had people turn woodpeckers into dance beats. We've made music with the sound of Indian monsoon rains for an amazing Indian pop artist. There is no end to the stories that people want to tell. And if you connect those stories through music, this art form that we listen to so deeply, and if you get lucky and you work with people like L-Acoustics, so you can do this with literally the best technology in the world to do it, I think we can make so much change. We can change people's relationship to each other in the natural world.
Oh, that's a good, I mean, yeah.
And I have to say, you guys know these numbers better than I do, but since Sounds Right launched, over $600,000 has been raised on streaming to go back to conservation efforts in less than a year. Yeah.
Which, if you know anything about the economics of streaming, you'd be like, that's good. That's good. And the point for me is it's new money from people just doing a thing that they love.
Mm. And if I speak Davos, it's innovative financing. And it's not just innovative financing. We'll raise $1 million this year that goes straight back to the frontline groups that works. We've seen the puma be brought back to an ecosystem.
Oh.
Well, that's a
We
sign.
made the thunder god angry or something.
Okay. Thunder. We're all okay.
Everyone's
Everything's
okay?
You okay?
Are you okay?
You okay?
Okay. We just really wanted to showcase
Yes.
Sound.
The wild.
in the wild.
Yeah. And I don't know if you want, we have the QR code so you can all follow nature.
Yeah, so we can share that.
You can share that
Yeah.
afterwards, but just kind of to see how it raises money, but it also engages the many people. So we say, kind of in about 2.5 years, we'll raise $5 million a year through both fees on soundscapes. Look out in the coffee shops and the hotels and the shops near you, because it'll start coming, and on royalties from the streaming platforms, and we'll engage 600 million people. And kind of in the world now where attention span and listening is shrinking, I think that's quite the feat, and it's only because everybody has left their egos at the door, and we work together in the most amazing way that I've seen. In a world where we're being pecked against each other, we're just saying, no, we will work with each other, and we will do this.
It's true.
Since we are on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum, I think I will dive a little more deeper into using sound just as communication, then building infrastructure for conservation. So what those numbers look like in your mind in next 5 years? Or what are the programs that you think people should know about, how they can contribute?
I mean, I think there's a few things that are needed. I mean, one of my little fantasies is that at these kind of gatherings, or at things like New York Climate Week or London Climate Week, the one things that would happen is we would have an artist in every single meeting and in every room playing a piece of music that uses nature sounds as well. I have a firm belief that everything would change. We would actually get further towards the goals that we have. Every time I see it happen, we've just seen it with Major. He's a beautiful example of that. But in particular, if people can perform live, everything changes. It goes back to where we started. Everybody's nervous system, right, is affected deeply. You can bring people to a state of emotional empathy and connection that is truly important if we're going to achieve any of the sort of change that we want. So, and I think institutionally in corporates, there's a lot of discussion. What I find a little frustrating sometimes is I think everybody's like, yeah, bring the culture, bring the artists and everything. It's very hard to raise that funding, actually. It's very, very hard to get. Everyone wants it, nobody wants to pay for it, is one thing that I would say. Sure. And yet artists can bring so much into every space. If we brought music into every space where we're having the kind of dialogues that are going on here, if the spirit of dialogue would be profoundly enhanced by more culture, more music, more art.
And I think too, when you're thinking about businesses and corporations, it's obviously you have to think, as an organization, okay, what stays true to our mission and who we are and how can we work with artists and culture. But there's if I just use L-Acoustics, for example, it's we build, we manufacture sound systems and technology. We care about greener touring. We care about noise pollution and what that means for people and their environments and their day-to-day well-being. All of those things, to what you're going back, what you're asking, tie holistically together. And I think, to Kathy's point, if we brought an artist into every meeting, that would change the conversation in a really beautiful way.
And again, if we talk corporate and talk marketing, and we take nature and sounds right as an example, this is a new way of looking at old problems, biodiversity loss, climate, etc. And we're not talking about 1.5 degrees. We're talking about cherishing nature and listening to nature and creating the relevance and the emotional connection and the empathy. And that's also what brands are aiming for. Long-term relevance. I'll talk about nature and long-term relevance. Yay. We're talking about trust, and we're kind of working with artists who are putting trust into this. And we're talking about, not just a connector, it's a creator. So we're talking about some of the things that are absolute key to big brands. So they should also be on board of this. So, kind of L-Acoustics is a great example of who sees that and believes that. But then also tying back to what Kathy said, we know the challenges we have ahead of us, and it's not just on the nature side, it's also on the whole fragmentation of the world. And we look at marketing, and marketing, I don't know, how much does Nike use to promote a shoe? Isn't it about $500 million a year? And it's and then we work with some of the funders who think, let's put 100,000 in to change mindsets. And it's yeah, that's a good start. It's a start.
Yeah, it's a beginning. But
and that's also why it's so wonderful to to work with the partners that we have in Soundsride, and many of the other initiatives that you and Live is involved in, is that it's not about the money, it's about the collaboration and what do you bring to the table. And when I look at a room like this and what you have created, Rupa, and I've seen the people come by this wonderful houses, if we map the resources and the connections that were here, wow. If we could collaborate, what could we change? It's so rich. But it's also putting that scarcity mindset away and say, okay, what can we create together instead of what can we compete about?
Also, music, joy, dancing, right? Yeah. We danced in here last night. It was beautiful. It was so fun. We, and the police got called, I think. So rock and roll. But one thing I always say is nobody voluntarily chooses to live a music-free life. So one thing you often hear, especially in NGO circles, is people talk about how do we reach certain people. I tell you how you reach people. You reach them through music. Everybody has a form of music that they love. Everybody. People really, even people who are very fairly unmusical, not particularly, discerning in their taste, there is still music that resonates to them. So there is nobody we can't touch, reach, change or move through really that art of deep listening and through using music.
That's beautiful. I was able to actually connect with somebody last night just because of that music. Yes. And it was beautiful. I'm a very shy person. And somehow my shyness was gone because I was intimidated by the influence. And we are we are here where you would meet a lot of influential people.
Like Major was touching on earlier, talking about drumming circles for therapy. My understanding is that it's believed now that dancing emerged once we settled in tribes of people that were more than about 40 to 50. The way that you can keep people bonded together was through movement and dancing together. So that relationship between your body, music, movement, dance, it's really, really profound. It's very old, and also music is deep. I mean, it's spiritual to people. It's very important, and that again, that depth. Think of that. What it means in somebody's life, how they embody their relationship to music.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful.
It's beautiful, but also, as we are focusing, as the world focuses a lot more on influence. Mm-hmm. How do we use the power of sound or art to really build authentic relationships? Because I think as leaders, we cannot create just influence. We have to be authentically connected to people. How do you do that?
That's a big question.
Yeah. I think one thing is don't just think of sound as entertainment. Yeah. Think of sound as dialogue for change. And like we were talking about, I think from the very beginning, listening to what you hear or don't hear in environments is really important. And engaging, exactly as we're talking about, with artists and culture, to make that change, I think is so important.
And connecting to each other.
Mm-hmm.
What we have done at UN Live is to get artists, whether poets, musicians, fashion designers, together through what we call a whole network of global we portals that we have across the globe, where we can bring people together, leave egos and logos at the door, and then come in as people, and then have those conversations across geographies and hierarchies and ages and issues, and create that sense of, we call it a global we, of belonging to something bigger, because we have so much othering now. We have so much, the whole nationalism right now, where we say, well, we're better than the others, and we're better than our neighbors, and we're kind of, or we're not, or we feel less, or whatever it is. But when you can break that down, you can often break that down through real conversations where you listen. And when we put that, the way we facilitate it, we also use sound, because it gets people kind of in a mood and in a mode where conversations can be real.
That's amazing. I have one last question for everyone. If leaders leave Davos with one new way of engaging, what that would be with sound?
Well, I'd love to see the theme of Davos. So if it was the spirit of dialogue, am I right, this year?
Yes.
Maybe it could just be deep listening next year.
Yes.
And think of all we could do with that.
Beautiful.
I'll be a little more shallow, even though I totally disagree. I totally agree. I'd say become a fan of nature. Take your phones, and that's all of you, but it's also the leaders. Become a fan of nature, and sounds right. You can just kind of click in, become a fan of nature, and then listen to nature on a regular basis. Whether it's the musicians you love who makes nature into their music, or whether it's your favorite sounds. Because it grounds you in another way, and it grounds you in remembering that nature is not just a resource you can extract. It's actually the foundation for our being.
Yeah. I mean, I would say we should all be thinking about, like, here at Davos as leaders and organizations, like, using sound for empathy. Like, music is, like we've all been talking about, such a great connector. How can you as an individual and you as an organization use it in that way? Have empathy for others. Like KATJA saying, like, think about nature. How can you, support that, not extract from it? And I think we'd all be in a better place.
Thank you. Thank you to our sound and sensory partner, L-Acoustic, to make us better listeners. And thank you for bringing amazing sound experience. Thank you.
Thank you to KATJA and KATHY.
We can clap louder for these amazing ladies.